Ethan Turner was a smart and kind-hearted 13-year-old, well-known and liked at his school. He was the son of Robert Turner, the new chief of police in town. That day, Ethan was particularly excited because he was on his way to visit his grandmother in the Riverdale neighborhood, a place filled with happy memories from his childhood. The smell of freshly baked bread always greeted him at her door, and his grandma's warm hugs made him feel safe. Ethan took his time strolling through the quiet streets, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the sound of fallen leaves crunching beneath his sneakers. He hummed a song his grandmother used to sing when he was little. The day seemed perfect, peaceful, calm, and beautiful. But as Ethan made a turn at the corner, he noticed two police officers walking behind him. At first, he didn't think much of it. Riverdale was a safe neighborhood, and seeing police officers on patrol was normal. However, after a while, Ethan began to feel something was off. The two officers weren't just walking along the street, they were following him. Ethan glanced over his shoulder casually, but when he saw their intense, unwelcoming expressions, his heart began to race. He felt an uneasy knot form in his stomach. What was going on? He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just walking to his grandmother's house. He tried to ignore the feeling, but their footsteps grew louder as they drew closer. The officers were gaining on him. Ethan decided to call his father, Robert Turner, the town's police chief. His father had always told him, "If you ever feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call me." Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking slightly as he dialed. His pulse was racing as his mind tried to make sense of the situation. Why were these officers following him? What did they want? It was unusual for him to call his father during a visit to his grandmother, but something didn't feel right. Meanwhile, at the police station, Robert Turner was sitting at his desk, reviewing some case files. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down to see that it was Ethan calling. His heart skipped a beat. Ethan hardly ever called during the day unless it was important. He quickly grabbed his keys and stood up. "Hey, son, what's up?" Robert answered, trying to sound casual. Ethan's voice was soft, almost trembling. "Dad, two officers are following me. They're acting strange, and I don't know what's happening." Immediately, Robert's demeanor shifted. His expression darkened, and he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Stay where you are, Ethan. I'll be there in a minute." Without another word, he hurried to the car, his mind racing with a mixture of anger and concern. Back on the street, Ethan was still walking as fast as he could, trying to stay calm. The two officers were getting closer now. He could hear their footsteps behind him. He tried to stay polite, to stay respectful, but the anxiety in his chest kept growing. His hands were trembling as he looked down the road, hoping for someone to pass by to help him. "Stop right there!" Officer Ray barked suddenly, his voice harsh and commanding. Ethan froze, heart racing. He had hoped to reach his grandmother's house before things escalated, but it seemed like that wasn't going to happen. He stopped and turned to face the officers. "I'm just going to visit my grandmother. She lives right up the street," he said calmly, trying to explain. Officer Ray didn't listen. He gave Ethan a look filled with suspicion. "You don't belong here. This is a tough neighborhood. What are you really doing?" he asked sharply. Ethan felt his stomach tighten with frustration. He had grown up in this neighborhood. He had spent his whole childhood here, playing with his friends, visiting his grandmother. It was his home. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just visiting my grandmother," Ethan said firmly, his voice steady despite the growing fear. Officer Ray narrowed his eyes, not believing Ethan. Meanwhile, Officer Thomas, the younger of the two, seemed to start having doubts. He glanced at Ethan for a moment, and for a brief second, Ethan thought he might say something in his defense. But instead, Officer Thomas said nothing and just followed Ray's lead. The tension was thick in the air. Ethan felt his chest tighten as Officer Ray stepped closer, his face hard and unyielding. Ethan's mind raced, trying to come up with something to say to diffuse the situation. But before he could say another word, Officer Ray barked, "What's in your pockets?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over him. He wasn't carrying anything dangerous, just a small box containing a scarf he had bought for his grandmother. But the officers weren't interested in listening. He didn't want to hand over the box, but before he could even protest, Officer Ray reached into his pocket and yanked it out. "What's this?" Officer Ray snapped, shaking the box in his hand as though it contained something illegal. Ethan's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He was terrified, but he refused to back down. "It's a gift from my grandmother," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. Officer Thomas, who had been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Ethan, and for a fleeting moment, his gaze softened. But it didn't last long. The younger officer still didn't say anything, just silently following Officer Ray's lead. The situation was escalating, and Ethan could feel his heart beating faster. His hands were shaking now. He wanted to explain himself, to tell them he was just a kid visiting his grandmother, but he couldn't get the words out fast enough. Just then, a black car screeched to a halt at the corner of the street. It was Chief Robert Turner, arriving just in time. He threw the door open and stormed out of the car, his face a mask of controlled fury. Officer Ray and Officer Thomas turned, clearly startled to see their boss standing there. "Chief, sir," Officer Ray stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling in the face of his superior. Robert Turner wasted no time. He walked straight up to the two officers, his voice cold and sharp. "What is going on here?" he demanded, not bothering to hide his anger. Officer Ray hesitated, his face flushed with embarrassment. We thought he was acting suspicious," he muttered. "He doesn't belong here. We thought he was up to something." Robert Turner's eyes blazed with fury. "You thought he was acting suspicious because of what? Because of where he is from? You didn't even bother to ask him anything," he snapped, his voice getting lower, more dangerous. "This is my son. He's visiting his grandmother." Officer Ray and Officer Thomas stood there, completely silent, their faces pale with shame. They hadn't expected the situation to escalate this way. Robert Turner took a step closer, his voice cold but calm. "Do you treat all the children in this neighborhood like this? Do you make assumptions about them based on where they live or what they look like?" he demanded. The two officers exchanged a glance, both now realizing how wrong they had been. Officer Ray's face turned pale, and Officer Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Robert Turner took a deep breath, and his voice softened, though it remained firm. "I expect better from you. From now on, you will treat everyone in this neighborhood with respect. You made a serious mistake today." The officers nodded, clearly regretful. Robert turned to Ethan, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home, son." As Robert and Ethan walked away, the two officers stood in place, their heads down in shame. They knew they had made a serious mistake, and the weight of that realization hung heavily in the air. Neither officer spoke as Robert led Ethan down the street. Ethan, though still shaken, felt a sense of pride swelling in his chest. His father had stepped in when it mattered, and he had stood up for him in the face of injustice. It was a moment that would stick with him forever. "Thanks, Dad," Ethan muttered quietly, his voice full of gratitude. Robert glanced down at his son, offering him a soft smile. "No need to thank me, Ethan. I'll always have your back. But I want you to remember something. Always stand up for what's right, no matter what." They continued walking down the street, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. It was a peaceful moment after the chaos, but it was also a moment of learning, a lesson about standing up against injustice and the importance of treating others with respect. As they reached the corner of the street, Ethan spotted his grandmother's house in the distance. The familiar sight of the front porch, the flowers in the garden, and the warm glow of the lights inside filled him with a sense of comfort. "That's where we're headed," Robert said, following Ethan's gaze. He smiled, proud of his son for staying strong in such a tough situation. "You're going to be just fine, Ethan. The world can be a tough place, but I know you have what it takes to make it better." Ethan smiled back at his father, grateful for his unwavering support. They reached the door of his grandmother's house, and Robert knocked gently. The door swung open, revealing Grandma Linda with a warm, welcoming smile. "Well, look who's here," Grandma Linda exclaimed, pulling Ethan into a warm hug. "I've been waiting for you, my dear." Robert smiled at the sight of his son in his grandmother's arms. It was a moment of peace, a moment where everything felt right again. As he looked at Ethan, he knew that, no matter what, his son had learned an important lesson today. As they sat down to enjoy dinner with Grandma Linda, Robert felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had protected his son, and in doing so, He had reminded both of them about the power of justice, respect, and family. In the end, this experience would shape Ethan's view of the world. He would never forget the lesson he had learned today: the importance of standing up for yourself and for others, no matter who they are or where they come from. As the night drew to a close and they finished their meal, Ethan looked at his father with gratitude. "Thanks for everything, Dad. I love you." Robert reached over and ruffled Ethan's hair affectionately. "I love you too, son," he said with a smile. "And remember, I'll always be here for you." With that, the two of them settled in for the night, knowing that no matter the challenges ahead, they would always have each other.